Hello. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all in the second day of our final workshop at Sebrapi. And it's an amazing opportunity that we are having today to listen to Professor Michael Roth and also discuss with him. So, Michael, I'm going to introduce you. Michael Roth is the Cameron Schreier Professor and Chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, where he also serves as the founding director of the Center for an Equitable Economy and Sustainable Society. Additionally, he is an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute and teaches at the New York University School of Medicine. He received his bachelor in African Studies from Morris Brown College and earned both his master degree and also PG in anthropology from the University of Chicago. His scholarship has been recognized with numerous honors, including the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute Fellowship and the Charles Warren Center Fellowship at Harvard University, as well as the ACLS Charles Riskamp Research Fellowship. Dr. Hoff's interdisciplinary research integrates political science, economics, history, and medical anthropology. His work maintains an explicit focus on the intersections of debt, slavery, insurance, forensics, and incarceration. He's the author of Forensics of Capital, a monograph that explores how debt and forensic profiles influence social standing and sovereignty in Senegal. And currently, he's at work on two new books centering on slavery, insurance, and incarceration. It's very interesting themes and career. And please, Michael, you have the floor.
I appreciate that very generous, very thoughtful introduction. I'm just going to sit here to be close to the computer. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you for these past few days. I'm so impressed with the researchers I've met and with just the vision of your program and center. And I'm just excited to return and to kind of stay in dialogue and collaboration and partnership. It's a very exciting space to be in. So I'll share a bit about my research and then, I look forward to your questions and comments and concerns. So I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions. So I guess the focus of my paper today will sort of be about different strategies for understanding the monetary value of human life in different contexts, and then also how research into those kinds of questions led to insight about a rather different but related kind of institution that's convict leasing. So the idea of private prison labor, or the idea of using a prison to generate revenue. So I sort of discovered a connection between this history of insurance and the history of convict leasing, and I'll explain how that happened. But I sort of first want to start with this statute, the Life Insurance Act of 1774. When we consider the idea of insuring someone else's life or benefiting from the monetary value of another person's sort of insurance policy, it's a strange idea in a way, because there have been very explicit statutes and laws against that. This law from the UK really was passed because in the past it was somewhat common to just speculate on people's lives, like to bet on how long a king or queen may live, or even homeless indigent people, their fate, just to kind of speculate and gamble on their lives. So there were sort of stipulations passed saying that it's illegal for someone to place a monetary value or to insure someone else's life unless they have a kind of what's called insurable interest in that person's life, like a parent to child, or a sort of spouse relationship, a kind of kin tie. Unless you have a kin relation, it was thought to be illegal to benefit from the monetary value of someone's life. So obviously that's not been the practice, although that was the law. So I think that's what we want to explore. When we think about insurance and slavery, maybe the most common institution that comes to mind is this idea of insuring enslaved people as cargo. And so this painting, J.M.W. Turner from 1840, the slave ship, or slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, really was in many ways likely inspired by the Zong atrocity of 1781. So essentially, in 1781, the British sea captain Luke Collingwood discovered that he didn't have enough water on board for the crew and for the enslaved cargo. So he decided, since the enslaved people were insured, he would just throw them overboard and collect the insurance money. So that was 132 people that he just threw overboard for the insurance money. So, of course, people were shocked and horrified to discover that he could disregard these lives so callously. And even the shock about that atrocity is interesting because slavery had been legal for hundreds of years at that point. But still, even when people understood slavery to be a legal institution, it didn't mean they thought of it in such a crude way that you could essentially just throw people overboard and collect the insurance money. So this kind of gave a lot of momentum to abolition, crusade, and sort of made people kind of outraged about this callous disregard for human life. And it's been discussed in many different registers. Ian Balcom wrote more of a kind of theoretical text, Spectres of the Atlantic. James Walvin wrote a history of the Zong ship, and M. Nabisi Philip wrote a kind of poetic rumination or meditation that took the trial record of the Zong and kind of used it to write poetry. But so different scholars have kind of grappled with this in different ways. Olaudah Equiano, who many of you are familiar with, formerly enslaved abolitionist, scholar, writer, wrote about the Zong and talked about the Zong, and just sort of expressed outrage for just more than 100 lives cut short, brutally cut short. And he was one of the sort of most outspoken critics of this kind of practice. And so I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that even someone like Aquino was thinking through this sort of predicament of insurance. And so what it reveals about how people's lives become sort of reduced to sort of monetary calculus. Now, there are other interesting examples of insurance, though, that sort of take us in different kinds of directions. In 1841, the slave ship Creole became sort of widely known when a man named Madison Washington had helped to lead an insurrection on board the Creole. And in fact, he had escaped from slavery in Virginia, made his way to Canada, came back to Virginia to try to free his wife from slavery, and was then re-enslaved and set aboard the slave ship Creole. And he helped lead an insurgency. Maybe about 17 of the 114 people on board were part of this insurrection. And they were aware that a previous slave insurrection had successfully sailed to British territory, and slavery had already been abolished in British territory. So they felt that if they could get to a British territory, they would be free. That's what they did. And then this became the subject of a lawsuit because the people who had insured the enslaved cargo wanted to collect the money for the cargo that never made it. And the judge had to decide, can these people collect on this enslaved cargo that escaped to freedom? Ultimately, what the judge decided was that when these people seized their freedom, they ceased to be cargo and became human. And because the policy didn't cover human beings, the insurers could not collect on the policy. So that's interesting because it's as if by freeing themselves from slavery, they actually sort of changed the sort of whole economic political relationship. So I think this is something I kind of want us to kind of sit with. What does it mean to sort of reduce someone to a monetary value in an insurance policy, but also what are the strategic political acts that can change how someone is valued? Another interesting example of insurance has to do with Reverend Noah Davis, who was born into slavery on Davis Plantation in Virginia. He was apprenticed as a cobbler, eventually became a reverend. He grew up sort of as the playmate of the young boy on the plantation. he convinced his owners to let him sort of become a preacher and to raise money through his sermons and to buy himself out of slavery. And then he was sort of working to try to also purchase his children and his wife who were still in slavery. And at different moments, he would use insurance policies as collateral when he was trying to free his family members from slavery. So if friends let him borrow money to buy some of his children, he would let them take out an insurance policy on the child's life in case he died before he could pay them back, and they would be able to collect the money later on. Or when he found out his son was incarcerated, he went and also sort of allowed someone to take out a policy on that son's life, and borrowed the money to free his son from jail. And he was aware that it's a common practice that if someone was enslaved and incarcerated, that if someone bailed them out of jail, then they could then have access to the free labor of that person. He didn't want that to happen. But it was just interesting to think about how Noah Davis really trafficked in the monetary value of his children and wife in order to help free them from slavery, in order to kind of generate the money he needed to free them from slavery. And so, in a way, it's maybe a bit paradoxical, even confusing, but Noah Davis was keenly aware of the monetary value of his family members in a way, maybe like how athletes or sex worker or somebody might just sort of traffic in their monetary value and see it as pretty uncontroversial. So in recent days, we've seen more attention to this question of insurance and slavery. Lloyd's of London has sort of started to kind of re-examine its historic ties to the slave trade and announced that they have more than 3,000 artifacts and documents related to the slave trade. I mean, the number of documents and artifacts they have is easily 10 times this. And, when they think about this, it's more like sort of specific documents that they think of as mentioning slavery in a very specific way. But you could argue that for a long period of time, virtually every ship that Lloyd's was insuring had some connection to slavery at somehow, because it's very hard to separate one's relationship to the slave trade when you're exchanging and insuring all kinds of voyages. So this sort of remains something to dig into further. And a lot of the register of insurance and slavery is about shame and apology, and but I think that the question of accountability goes much deeper, and I think I would love us to sort of talk about what constitutes accountability and what's at stake in this legacy. Not merely sort of apologies or shame and guilt or confession, but sort of what are the financial relationships over time, and how do we think about those financial relationships over time? So I've had a National Science Foundation fellowship to sort of trace these histories of actuarial science and practices of underwriting and the slave trade, and um, also sort of benefited from archives that were made available through actually the reparations movement and legislation passed as part of the reparations movement. So in the United States, in California and in Illinois, there have been African American elected officials who have passed and had sort of legislation passed that says if you're a financial institution, you have to disclose your historic relationship to the slave trade. And so usually insurance companies may say, okay, we've been around since this year. Over this time, we've acquired these companies that had these policies going back, and they'll just sort of send letters explaining that. And it initially it wasn't even really organized in like an Excel spreadsheet or anything well organized, just maybe some tables and some papers and things like that. So as part of this research, one of the things I've done over time is to kind of try to systematically gather and organize this information and to see what it can tell us about how people were insured and what they were insured for, and how the industry kind of worked. And so it's kind of just been dumped into these insurance registries, as you can see here. The name of the enslaved person, where they lived or worked, maybe the kind of policy information that exists, the name of the slaveholder, where they lived or worked, and the insurance company that had the policy. And this either means that that insurance company acquired the value of the policies over time, or that they had that policy since that earlier moment in some form. Like New York Life was once Nautilus, it's been around since the antebellum period. AIG was once called US Life. So these companies have been around for a long time, but sometimes change their names over time. Here's an example of a policy on an enslaved person from Aetna. And I would say the overwhelming majority of the policies we've known about until recently either were held by New York Life, AIG, or Aetna. So here's basically what the fuller Excel spreadsheet would look like once you start to organize information. Like I said, the location of the enslaved person, usually only the first name of the enslaved person, where they lived, sometimes what they did for a living, the company that held the policy, policy information, sometimes notes on what they were doing. And I'll come back to this question of expertise and this question of labor, because I think one important feature of this research is getting deeper insight into what enslaved people were doing, and what made them valuable to insurance companies. Because as I explained before, with the enslaved people insured on as cargo, you have the assumption there that it doesn't matter who the individual enslaved people were. If it's 500 enslaved people on a ship, they're each valued the same. And it's really about the value of the cargo in the aggregate, right? But as you can see here, there is attention to the specific skill set of the enslaved person, which reveals that the expertise or the skills or labor of that enslaved person was valued in these insurance contracts. And so what you start to realize is that in the last few decades of legalized slavery in the United States in particular, um, there was a kind of shift in the way that the practice of insuring enslaved people worked. And this shift largely had to do with um, 1808, like laws passed in 1808, which made it illegal to bring enslaved people into the US. So slavery was obviously legal in the US until 1865 when sort of the Civil War ended. But after 1808, you couldn't bring in enslaved people to the US. And so the emphasis on getting slave labor became about breeding enslaved people. It became about kidnapping people sometimes, and it also became about renting enslaved people from people who had them in large numbers. So let's say someone had hundreds of slaves, you wanted slave labor, you might just rent them. And when someone rented you slaves, they may also insure them because they would want to make sure they didn't lose the value of that asset when it's rented out to someone else or in someone else's possession. So this idea of insuring enslaved people became much bigger after 1808. And in particular, if the enslaved people were working for a particular kind of industry, then that expertise would become really valuable for other people who wanted to hire those slaves for the same kind of work. So let's say 20 slaves had already worked on a railroad. If you own a railroad, you'd rather rent those 20 slaves than 20 slaves who have been picking cotton or doing carpentry or something else. So the industry started to change where people were very interested in the expertise enslaved people had acquired. Um, you can see some different sort of qualifications noted here at the bottom of this, like coal pits, steamboats, mining, pilot. So there's different kinds of extra premiums associated with particular kind of skills. And so I've worked with some cartographers to try to understand what this looks like visually. Like where was this practice happening throughout the United States? And you'll notice that obviously the industry in renting and insuring enslaved people, a lot of it was sort of focused on the South, to some extent the Midwest, around sort of coastal regions or rivers sort of networks. A lot of it has to do kind of with urban slavery or slavery in urban areas because there were a lot of different kinds of industries. So you might have like steamboats in close proximity to coal mines and railroads. So in those kinds of situations, you'd have a lot of activity around renting out and insuring enslaved people. So a lot of activity around port cities in particular, or coastal sort of river cities. Sort of more work on just teasing out which kind of industry the sort of bubbles corresponding to the number of people and things like that. And then there's actually very little documentation on the transactions, like the full circuit of the policies. Like we have some policy information, we know when policies were taken out, but I've sort of tried to do some work on when and how they were paid out. But it's many of these records have been lost to history, and in particular because insurance companies are often bought up by bigger companies over time, it's very hard to kind of trace what's happening within the insurance industry over time. So I've built some kind of data visualizations online, and I'll say a bit about how it has been organized. And although the site's now down being rebuilt, but here you have an enslaved person, Harry, in Alabama, the owner, H.M. Wheat, occupation blacksmith, and the insurance company, Baltimore Life Insurance Company, which was one of the sort of biggest companies in the antebellum period, insuring enslaved people. Here you have similar information, and then you have also the different companies that had these policies. So AIG, Aetna, Baltimore Life, New York Life, and now I've more recently with my research team found thousands more policies from a company's Southern Mutual Life Insurance Company. But I guess I want to sort of note that, as I mentioned before, there's a range of occupations, and I think this is useful to think through when you break down the kind of work enslaved people were doing. So, in terms of artisanal work, it ranges from cobblers, blacksmiths, bakers, all kinds of stuff like that. Steamboat workers, and even on steamboats, a lot of different kinds of occupations like engineers, cooks, waiters, coal miners, and all various kinds of industrialists, agricultural labor, then even various different kinds of servants and domestic workers and things like that. And when you start to look at it, basically it breaks down to kind of enslaved people who were insured often fell into one of three main categories. They were sort of working in hazardous, very lucrative industries like steamboats, railroads, or coal mines. Um, they were doing artisanal work like blacksmiths, cobblers, masons, or they were bureaucrats, like they managed households, or they were clerks or drivers. And what's interesting about this from the standpoint of sort of labor history is that really, in many ways, this is like the sort of foundation of the working class, if you think about it, right? Like these are a lot of the kind of jobs that are like highly skilled. We'll see a lot of like union activity around many of these jobs. We'll see sort of the awareness by workers that these jobs generate a lot of revenue for companies, and even that they are putting workers at risk, and therefore workers deserve certain benefits and certain kind of medical care, like coal miners, for instance. A lot of sort of protests and union organizing over time to show the respiratory challenges that workers are subjected to. So in many ways, this could seem like just about sort of slavery and insurance, but in many ways, it's also about just the kind of formation of the US working class, or the formation of the working class, and kind of laying the foundation for that. And I think, in a sense, it's useful to think of this category of enslaved people as being highly valued, highly skilled, even having a lot more mobility than we usually associate with enslaved people, in the sense that they're not just sort of working on a plantation all day under the lash or under sort of guards on a horseback with shotguns. They're sort of, maybe working as a carpenter and by themselves with one overseer or something like that. So there's some kind of calculations about how to think about the valuations, but I'll skip through that. Now, one thing I kind of want to talk about is the way that African American scholars have tried to write and think about this. So, Carter G. Woodson wrote an article, Insurance Business Among Negroes. And one of the things he talked about was just the range of practices that could be considered a kind of insurance, from mutual aid societies among enslaved people, where they're just sort of organized to kind of support each other, sometimes in clandestine organizations, to kind of church societies or burial societies of various kinds. And so for him, it was very important to kind of think through what counts as insurance and what counts as business. And he talked about the challenge of sort of raising and sustaining capital to have like formal insurance companies. And W.E.B. Du Bois uh, wrote about insurance companies as well. And I'm very particularly compelled by this one quote: Negroes should be emphatically warned against unstable insurance societies, conducted by irresponsible parties and offering insurance for small weekly payments, which really amount to exorbitant rates. And so for Du Bois, although he saw and understood the promise of insurance, he was very concerned that it sort of masquerades as something that's beneficial to you, but in fact is quite expensive and ultimately never provides you the kind of security that it promises you. And Du Bois is much more convinced that like sort of mutual aid societies and sort of more organic formations were much more beneficial for African Americans than really sort of formal corporate insurance companies. And even this includes for him Black insurance companies. You know, he understood why they were coming about and why they were beneficial, but also had strong reservations about whether that kind of corporate form is ultimately going to be beneficial to people or whether it's not just going to be another version of sort of exploitation. I also wanted to note that many prominent African Americans come from a kind of insurance background, like Barry Gordy, founder of Motown. His mother sold insurance. That's largely how he made their family had sort of middle class status. Lorraine Hansberry, who was the first African American woman to have a Broadway play. Her play Raisin in the Sun was actually the whole plot of the play turned on insurance. It was about like a family where the grandfather dies and he leaves the insurance life insurance to the family, and then they're trying to figure out what to do about it, and they're trying to buy a house, but in a time of redlining, there's white families protesting them moving into the house, and then the son wants to start a business, but really the whole plot of the whole play is about what to do with this life insurance policy from the grandfather. So it's just interesting to think about African Americans as trying to kind of theorize this question of insurance and make sense of it. So I also sort of wanted to point to a couple different examples of the way that we might think about this legacy. So, in addition to the predicament that sort of African Americans have faced, whether insured as cargo or dealing with this kind of disproportionate valuation post emancipation, there's a lot about the way that the insurance industry continues to be exploitative that goes back to this legacy. So, this man, Joseph Carmadre, was from Rhode Island. He was known as a philanthropist and an accountant, and he ultimately was indicted for tens of millions of dollars he made from essentially what was understood to be insurance fraud. Although most of the charges he beat, and the only charges he was convicted of were sort of misleading the people he worked with, who were elderly people who he convinced to sell him the value of their life insurance policies in exchange for cash upfront. So I mentioned that, you know, there was a lot of statutes, particularly going back to 18th century in the UK, governing when someone can benefit from the sort of monetary value of someone else's life insurance policy. And that principle is called insurable interest. As I said, it in most instances it's understood to be a kin relation, like a parent-child relationship or a spouse relationship. But Joseph Carmadre had studied like insurance law in Rhode Island, and he discovered that Rhode Island didn't have that principle of insurable interest, and that your life was just kind of seen as a commodity that you could buy and sell freely. And so he just would offer someone, let's say their insurance policy is worth, you know, $20,000, he might offer them $2,000. And for a terminally ill elderly person, they might just take the $2,000 because maybe they have medical bills or maybe they want to leave money to a family member, and they would take that. And when they died, he would get the money from their insurance policy, which was exponentially more than the cash value he paid them. So I just sort of want to share that to say that this legacy of sort of profiting from someone else's insurance policy is something that now continues in a different register. Maybe the most bizarre example I've come across is that Rick Perry, who was actually a former U.S. presidential candidate in 2003, he had been sort of in conversations with this Swiss financial firm, UBS, and Rick Perry wanted to take out life insurance policies on public school teachers in the state of Texas. And his argument was that as governor of Texas, the public school teachers were like his employees. So he had an insurable interest in benefiting from the monetary value of the public school teachers as their employer. And he ended up dropping this idea because it, you know, was viewed as unsavory. But the most interesting thing to me is that it was not seen as illegal to do this. You know, it was just that he didn't want the negative publicity associated with it. But the idea that as public school teachers, the governor of Texas could have taken out insurance policies on their life is really sort of, in many ways, distressing, but also revealing. And then I guess before I sort of show the connection to convict leasing, I wanted to highlight this example because this particular kind of insurance became really big in the United States during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and it's sometimes referred to as a viatical insurance policy. And basically, it's like someone, again, an example of someone who's terminally ill and who expects to die soon, and um, they can sort of take out a policy that's really highly valued and receive a lot of money. And and so this proliferated, even was marketed to people sort of through like gay and lesbian magazines and things like that during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. This example in particular is distressing because uh, this person's employer made money from them and they were terminally ill and they had HIV. And there are a lot of questions about like how can an employer have a life insurance policy on you without your permission, which has happened multiple times. And then also this question of what information does your employer know about your health and things like that. And a lot of how this was possible is that life insurance policies on employees was viewed as a kind of security. So it had a different kind of financial categorization than the kind of policy you take out for yourself or something. So there's been a lot of sort of curious dynamics around this. Um, so the connection to convict leasing came about because as I was building this sort of website and Excel spreadsheet, I was noticing that uh, in Kentucky, the form of labor the enslaved people did was not listed. And so I was very curious about like, okay, what would an enslaved person have been doing in Kentucky that would have been seen as very highly valuable and they could have been rented out and insured, but like what would it have been? And for those of you who don't know a lot about the United States agricultural history, Kentucky slavery was legalized. It was in the Midwest, but they couldn't really have major plantations in Kentucky. So slavery was very kind of urban and it was very restricted to like kind of smaller plots, even household plots or something. And so one thing I discovered was that like, okay, hemp was really big. What we would think of as a kind of marijuana plant, hemp was really big in Kentucky because they couldn't grow cotton, and they basically used hemp as a substitute for cotton. So they would make clothes out of hemp and things like that. And then I found this uh, memo where the warden of the prison in Kentucky had written to the governor of the state, and he said that he didn't want to produce hemp in the prisons anymore, even though it had been the biggest source of revenue for 3 decades. And so that memo was dated to like 1860. So I was really curious, okay, what does that mean that hemp had been the biggest source of revenue in the prison for 3 decades? And I knew that hemp was tied to slavery in Kentucky, but I didn't know about the connection between hemp and prisons. And it turned out that there was a guy, Joel Scott, who in 1825 had convinced the state legislature to lease the prison to him. And he ran it as a private business and he introduced hemp and hemp as a crop that really had only been worked by enslaved people before. And he started having incarcerated people work on hemp. Now, this is a bit strange because in the United States in particular, when we think of convict leasing or the idea of prisoners doing slave labor, we usually talk about it in relation to the 13th Amendment. So you see like the new Jim Crow or Ava DuVernay's critically acclaimed film 13th. And this idea in particular, the exception clause, like you can't have slavery or involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So this came about in 1865, and people talk about it as a way of sort of preserving slavery through convict leasing. But this example I'm giving of Joe Scott is like from 1825. So this is like 4 decades before this. And in fact, the prison in Kentucky was built when Kentucky was first settled after the American Revolution. So in many ways, they were inspired by Thomas Jefferson's theories about prison as progressive legal reform as a progressive substitute for capital punishment. And so they built the prison in Kentucky as soon as it was settled, even before there's anyone to incarcerate, because their idea was like, we should not have capital punishment for all serious crimes. We should just have a prison. People initially went there for like a few weeks, a few months, and that was it. But after Joel Scott introduced hemp farming into the prison, it kind of extended prison sentences, and prison became a lot more like slave labor, and it became this sort of engine for sort of revenue. And I'll just, in closing, share a quote about how hemp farming was discussed in Kentucky. Here, this quote, quite a variety of machinery has been tried for hemp breaking, together with Dutch, Irish, and natives, all different groups who have been used. But a stout Negro man with a good handbrake, fair task before him, prompt pay for his overwork, now has a decided preference, if not a complete monopoly. Breaking and cleaning by horsepower machinery is a possible achievement, but would hardly be profitable. So there was this idea that, like, okay, enslaved people, in particular the Negro, is really good at working with hemp and far exceeds, outperforms machinery, any other ethnic group. And in a weird way, this is kind of like a kind of insult masquerading as a compliment, like this idea that the Negro is just genius with hemp. And there were a lot of discourses like, okay, hemp is an eccentric, bizarre crop. Negroes are eccentric and bizarre. Um, and so there was this idea that, okay, hemp can only be done by Negroes. But after it was introduced into the prison, all of a sudden, prison labor became a lot more like slave labor and hemp was produced in the prisons, you know? So I think that both this story of, if I put the two sort of sides of the project side by side, in one case, you have this group of enslaved people who are insured and highly skilled. And even though they are enslaved legally, their lifestyle and the way they're treated is kind of approximating a free worker, you know? In this other context, you have this group of people who are technically free, but in terms of their being incarcerated and the form of labor they're subjected to, their lives are kind of approaching that of an enslaved person, you know? And in many ways, it just sort of reveals that in the last few decades of legalized slavery in the United States, there were kind of porous boundaries between sort of what constituted kind of slavery and what constituted freedom for sort of heavily exploited people. And I think that's just kind of an interesting and important contradiction to sit with. You know, maybe one example I could give in closing is there was even like a coal mine in Virginia where, you know, you have enslaved workers and free workers, white workers working side by side. And the mines would often explode. There'd be mining accidents all the time. And there may be just 5 free workers and 20 slaves. And they may put the names of the free white workers in the newspaper and then just say 20 slaves, not even name them because they're legally property. But at the same time, those slaves were insured, so they were valuable assets to the company in a way that the white workers were not. So in a way, you have these enslaved people whose lives are very valuable, and you have these free white workers whose lives are not valuable. And I think that, in a sense, that kind of captures some of the contradictions I'm trying to tease out between sort of insuring enslaved people and heavily exploiting white people in a kind of convict lease system. So I guess I'll close there, but I love your questions, thoughts, reactions, and thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Michael, for your
Thank you.
talk. It's a very important discussion. Well, in my position here, because I'm not a specialist in the subject, but I would like to react quickly to your talk and give you space for more clarification. So, and I'm sure that we will have other questions. Well, I would like to limit myself actually to one point, but it's a very general comment. Maybe it's a little vague. But I totally understand that this is a powerful talk because it's dealing with various topics that are related to discussions about racism in general, for sure, specifically in historical terms that you're dealing with. And I also believe it teaches us a lot about how to understand and analyze complexities of racism. You know, if you're doing this historically, because you're saying something that, well, we know what it means, what is the general thesis about enslaved people as, you know, commodity, as non-human. They, they can have a name, you know, but they are, on the other hand, valuable commodities, and they are treated as properties. So there's a very interesting and complex negotiations in order to to get more from this kind of property, for sure. And it's interesting too, because we know that what remains before and continues to remain today, and it's just a quick reaction here to your talk. I think that has to do with this idea that we continue treating Black people as non-human. Yesterday, we discussed about violence and invisibility, and all of it has a history. It's a process, it didn't come from and nowhere. It has to do with the different ideas we have about reification of these people and the way they are unequally treated to this day. And of course, and that's my general comment, I would like to hear a little more about it from you, is that we always see that the history of oppression, of racial oppression, is always the history of racial social resistance as well. So, listen to you now. I remember an author, an anthropologist in Brazil, who discussed many issues about slavery, but specifically the role of law and legal discussions. His name is Sidney Chalhoub. Many of you, I know that historian and anthropologist. I remembered him because of the role of law specifically, and the image that the law allows that the enslaved are always, passive and passive addressees, passive objects of law. And the central point that he's questioning this specific idea, and he's trying to show that Black people always try to negotiate with domination, albeit with many limitations. That's the point. But they try to negotiate legal issues with a lot of restrictions, and always seem to fight for freedom in specific contexts. So that's my general reaction. So in these historical studies, do you see uh, uh, if there are, and you mentioned some aspects of it right now, but possible strategies we could say for the agency of enslaved people, because you mentioned something that gave me the impression that this could be seen in that period of time as well, but with a lot of ambivalence. Um, would you see room for the valorization of some categories among enslaved workers? That's what you mentioned. Some categories who could have higher insurance values, for example, compared to others. And so they could use this to say, to, negotiate, for example, working conditions. Sometimes it's possible. You mentioned that. Sometimes it's not. What would be the difference if you see some possible urgency in this aspect? You mentioned Du Bois once saying that, I don't know if I totally understood, but that it would be a mistake to think that you are in a better position. So it would be illusory to think that they would have any kind of benefit from this situation. Uh, the other the other aspect is a curiosity, because you said that you came into Brazil other times, and so but if you have other comparative studies on the same subject, comparative perspectives on this topic, how could we discuss similar forms, for example, slave insurance or related legal aspects in commercial mechanisms that exist in Brazil, but other places as well? Um, And if you can mention something about this more comparative perspectives. So, Michael, this is just a starting point
Sure, yeah, thank you. Those are great questions.
okay,
That was
yeah.
a very insightful discussion and great questions. And I'll say a bit in response to them, and then I'll love to hear your thoughts as an audience. I'll start with the question of Brazil, the last question, because actually think that the history it's 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 a more nuanced take. The history, the way slavery is discussed, let's say in the historiography of Brazil or Latin America and the Caribbean, and even the way slavery is understood, let's say medieval, early modern Africa, is in many ways, I think, more useful for understanding how slavery works in general. And I think the reason I've had different kinds of insights than other people about slavery is because I was trained as an Africanist. So for me, someone who's enslaved, this is like a legal category, but it's not an assumption of the person's value, or it's not damning in the way that people use slavery in the history of the United States. So because the paradigm of slavery and the theoretically people talk about it and think about it as chattel slavery, for them, essentially a slave is somebody who's tied to a post and beaten all day, maybe, or something like that. It's just kind of a very extreme idea of violence. And of course, slavery is saturated with violence, but it's not always that kind of violence where it's just gratuitous and seemingly sort of without purpose. It could be much more coercive, almost like, so an example I think about a lot, for instance, is also in the last few decades of legalized slavery, you might have a planter moving from Virginia to Louisiana, and he has four enslaved people he owns, and he wants land from the bank. So he'll mortgage those slaves to the bank, right? So he has four slaves as collateral to the bank. He gets land. If he doesn't pay on the land consistently, they'll seize those slaves, right? If he does, he keeps those slaves. And when you look at it more closely, you may notice that when he dies, he leaves his land to one of the slaves. So that's weird. It turns out it's those four slaves are like a woman he purchased years before, raped, had children with, and it was essentially they were living as like a biracial family or something like that, right? So it could be like essentially his partner, their three children, she inherits the wealth when he dies, and now they become like a free family of color in New Orleans or something like that. And that's violent. It's violent, incredibly violent, but it's almost like the violent of like domestic partnership, like a very violent relationship, not just violence like gratuitous violence we associate with slavery. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that the question of violence is not separate from the question of social mobility. It's not the question of gender and expertise and all these and even the financial relationship governing how they interact. So I think when we think about violence, we think about social mobility, we have to, as we've been doing the past few days, have more of a kind of intersectional analysis. But I think this kind of assumption that slavery is just about violence, naked violence, beating someone to death, treating them as useless is not particularly illuminating for how slavery worked as a social institution. Um, I think in terms of examples and things, I want to share a couple of examples I think are instructive. So some of you may be familiar with Solomon Northup, who was like a free African American man from Saratoga, New York. He was kidnapped and he visited DC. He was sold into slavery. He was he wrote a memoir called 12 Years a Slave. He was enslaved for 12 years till he escaped. And when he was enslaved, he worked as like a carpenter, basically a kind of an engineer. And he was a businessman. He was smart, but that idea that he was seen as having expertise and the people who owned him valued that. That's a kind of interesting for the categories of enslaved people I'm talking about. And there's a moment in his memoir where he talks about he got into a fight with his overseer, and that even in the movie version, Steve McQueen, the guy throws a rope over the tree and it goes around his neck, and the man wants to lynch him. And then somebody else comes over and says, listen, this man is mortgaged to the bank. So unless you have the money to pay this mortgage, you cannot kill him, right? And that's interesting because you sort of think, well, it's his financial relationship to the estate that saved his life. You know what I mean? So again, that's violent and it's disturbing, but it doesn't suggest that all enslaved people are available for just gratuitous violence under any circumstance at any time. And I guess the last example I might give is, if you look at like Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman he had children with and stuff, a lot of her relatives worked for him. Like her brother was like his chef, her cousin was like his butler. A lot of the men in her family worked very closely with Thomas Jefferson, and they had these privileged roles in the estate. And it's as if her leverage over him gave them privileged roles in the plantation estate, you know? Like they weren't doing just like picking cotton or these other kind of roles. They were in these kind of roles of servitude. And I think that's also revealing that like there's something about the range of possibilities even for an enslaved person, or there's even the understanding that enslaved people as bureaucrats were essential to maintaining the plantation economy and plantation system that almost sometimes feels more like a kingdom or something, or like a very sophisticated bureaucratic organization. And again, is not like how slavery is sometimes talked about as if any slave is just property to easily be destroyed, like, I don't know, like a crate of mangoes or something. You know what I mean? Like, but this idea that they're having expertise and that they're essential to the operation and the functioning of the whole industry or something. You know. So I guess so these are great.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. This was fascinating, and then it's a lot of work, I imagine, to put this up together, also to interpret it historically, also, and also the contemporary consequence. But there was some years ago here in São Paulo, there was some news about some archive findings on an architect actually named Tebas, which was responsible for building what now became the Cathedral of São Paulo. So there was a lot of people working on that. And it's centuries ago, and it was shocking that the only documentation we had about this person was the documents of who owned him and who he was lent to and how much value he produced. That was like the most impressive thing. Like he was really respected as an architect, so much that he was responsible for building the cathedral of the city. So maybe this interests you. Like
It does, yeah.
the only documents that we have are related to, I think he was owned by someone, the man died, and then he became kind of like the woman, the widow would rent him out in the city to the state and so on. So that's why we have documentation on him. So I thought it would be interesting for you. Second, if you could talk a little bit more about this contradiction that you mentioned about like how these insurances kind of add value to this object slash subject, the enslaved person. It not only adds value, but also recognizes actually the value because the person produces a lot of value. That's why it's been insured. You mentioned like the contradiction between the poor white workers and the insured enslaved black people, and this contradiction, and made me think about, I don't know, athletes, big athletes today, and some of them have insurance on the high value that they have. I don't know if it's something you think about. The third point is something we've been discussing a lot in Brazil in the last decade. It's how all these plantations in the Americas were first seen as some kind of prehistorical thing, but then when people really looked at it, it looked very much like the finance global market was actually being created there, because you had lots of risks, like will the crops generate profit, you have the slave ships and so on. So there's this hypothesis that plantations in the America kind of prepared the way for rational capitalism in industries, but also in the stock market and so on. And I imagine this may be one of the consequences of your research as well. Like there is some gambling with lives here in a very speculative way that, I don't know, would relate to stock market today. And finally, um, so these enslaved people, they are seen as machines in the sense that they may be rented. They provide us a certain service in a very similar way to how machines or artificial intelligence is being used today. This is a very speculative comment, but if you'd have something to add, I'll be thankful.
Yeah, great questions, comments. I just quickly on the first example, I'm very interested. I'm going to look into that, and I want to hear. I would love to talk to you more about that. But I think this it's a great example. And the fact that the only records are the financial records, I guess, goes to the second point in a way, because I think what this research reveals is in part that people making money from slaves from their expertise see them differently than how they were seen in the eyes of the law or in general. So in general, people may say, "Oh, that's a slave, their property." But to someone who owns that person, it's like, "Oh, that blacksmith, he can do things I could never do. He can make things I could never make." And so then the opportunity there to generate revenue from that skill set, and it's sort of the ethnographic insight about that person's expertise, which I think is, as scholars, obviously, and as anthropologists in particular, right? I think we would say, like, okay, anybody who's working in an industry at a craft is acquiring valuable expertise. We know that ethnographically, but it's interesting to see it leveraged in the financial marketplace, that even the people who own them observe what's valuable about their skill set and even about different kinds of skills they could be put to. So yes, I think that there's something important about that insight of where value comes from for people who are always trying to squeeze extra value out of someone. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't show up maybe in broad theories of the law for whole categories or demographics or something. The plantation finance thing is very interesting to me because I've been thinking a lot about this in revisiting histories, early histories of property and things. And when you look at it, there's some like accountants who and critical accounting scholars who will say like the history of property has not been written with enough nuance, because sometimes they will refer to people as property owners and they'll say like, well, when you look at how those people sign the deed, they were like a craft person or like a artisanal person. They weren't like a huge landowner or something, because they have different signatures. And then you have to know about medieval signatures to know that or something like that. But I think there's a lot about the history of plantations and histories of finance that we should revisit with more care, because there's something about maybe certain taken for granted assumptions, like you said, about which economies were more advanced, less advanced, which parts of the world are shaping which kinds of financial relationships. And I think when we revisit that, we see early forms of speculation, risk, finance, expertise, different ideas of land. There's a lot more there than has been discussed. And then with AI, yeah. So I think the AI question, I think one important relationship to this work on insurance is like the liability question. And we were discussing this a little bit earlier, but like, okay, when people talk about like an electric car, let's say if an electric car is insured or something, and it causes damage to property or even hurts someone, who is liable for that, right? Is it the driver of the electric car? Let's say it's a Tesla self-driving. Is it the driver who should have been driving but they were self-driving? Is it the software designer? Is it some other kind of technician who could be monitoring the car at some point, right? But it's like even the question of liability and who's responsible for any damage the car causes is an interesting question with an autonomous or ostensibly autonomous vehicle. And in a way, what the tech industry would have you believe is there's no precedent, there's no way to know. We have to think about it, but they want to kind of spare themselves the liability. So it's not our fault, it's not our system design or software design. But there are long histories of liability related to something you own or an object you own. Like there's even farmers debating if they're liable for a pig running through someone else's fence or something like that. So in the history of the world, there's a lot of sort of parallels and context for this question of like, are you liable when something that you're supposed to own or control causes damage or injury or something like that? Not to even mention the whole history of inanimate objects causing injury or death, which is also interesting in itself. So I think there's a lot there, with your questions. But thank you for that. Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much. I
Thank you.
learned a lot. And I should say, my name is Miriam. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a totally outsider for this field.
That's okay.
So, yeah. I have one question that is, do enslaved works appears in the US labor literature? I'm asking this because here in Brazil, as a colleague, a historian called Flávio Gomes points out, these works, enslaved works, been have been largely ignored, overlooked in the literature. At least this is what I can say, considering that I was following more than 15 years ago Flávio Gomes' academic work. And I also would like to say that the idea of cargo property or enslaved doesn't to me they had some rights. This is the case in Brazil. There are some colleagues who have been researching about enslaved people going to the court to complain about a few rights, but at least they had rights. So I'm just trying to show how it's more complex. And something that I really, I'm impressed with your work is how much rubbish you know, building in school, because I don't know from the audience, but considering, you know, my background about, even at the university, we don't talk this way about the story in the US is always the idea of, you know, nobodies, this so, yeah, it's violence, but the way you talk, I will stop here. Just I have so much things to ask, but maybe I can ask after during the lunch, if don't bother you.
No, I would love that. Thank you.
Just one more. I was wondering, you are a medical anthropologist, and I don't know how. Maybe you can talk about when you decide to work about insurance. It's about the life, the idea of life, and you would see life as more than the a commodity and the less things, really. About the barracão, I know you have wrote about Zora Hoston, and yeah, for sure, the title talk about Consola as a cargo, but also hold, you know, the description and the way she gave voice to him, show he in exile, and he was so aware of, you know, be a worker that and that idea that there was no any kind of reparation. He expect some kind of financial, you know, response. I stop here and thank you so much.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thank you. I think to start where you ended, this idea of reparations, I mentioned from an archival standpoint, some of this data comes to us through legislation that the companies have to disclose. But then I think I see the whole question of reparations like uncontroversially, in the sense that maybe because I'm very interested in forensics, and this maybe relates to some of my interest in medicine, but like, God forbid if someone you know is in a fatal accident, right? Car accident or something, and they die, you wouldn't think that their life is reducible to some monetary amount, but you still would want a settlement, right? It would be an injustice. It'd be offensive if someone kills a family member in a car accident and never has to pay anything, right? So there's a way that, like, every day, all kinds of ways we do these transactions, we do these calculations of the loss of life and the value of the loss of life. Even for federal agencies in the United States, like, each year they come up with budgets about how much funding they want from the government, and they often talk about how many lives they'll save for that funding, and they even have sort of calculations you can do on how they understand and quantify human life. So you could say, like, the FDA essentially is putting $8 million per life, or the EPA is essentially saying it's like $10 million per life saved for these regulations that they want to have, the kind of budget they need. And what's funny about that is that you can even look at different presidencies in the United States and see that they funded these agencies a lot more than others. So you could say essentially, like, this US president essentially valued life at $12 million per life. This one treats it like $8 million per life, because that's how little they spent on regulations. Like, one wants to expand the FDA, one wants to shut down the FDA. Those are very different statements about what's going to save lives, because you're going to endanger people if you're not really carefully evaluating the pesticides in their foods, or the toxins in the rivers, or things like that. So I think from a medical and anthropological standpoint, this question of life and safety, regulation, toxicity, these are some issues that come up. I think the work of the enslaved people, like their work is a great question, and how it's taken, like, or not taken up. I mean, one, I think when reading slave narratives, people have often talked about them in terms of the horrors of slavery. And I guess that's how they're sometimes presented, as being about the horrors of slavery. And then I guess that leads to a focus on the violence of slavery and the sort of what makes slavery dangerous, problematic, offensive. But like there's in some narratives so much there. In Noah Davis, there's a lot about his financial strategy. Other ones I've been struck by passages even about somebody getting dressed to go to a party. One guy was like, okay, he borrowed a handkerchief from his aunt and he tore it in half and he put one in his pocket and he put one here. Then he had coins he put in his pocket, so when he was dancing, it would make noise. That's just interesting, you know, that like he has a whole passage about like getting dressed to go out and how important that was for him and what his style was. And he's like, when I go out, they're gonna say this is the best dressed dude in the neighborhood. You know, like this is just interesting. So I think there's a lot more in slave narratives than what people tend to pick up on them. Maybe because those are the questions they're concerned with, and I'm concerned with different sorts of questions. You know, and maybe I'll just stop there for now. But I guess I would love to hear more. I want to hear more about those. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Michael. I would like to hear you more about the relation between this presentation and your more general approach of the forensics of capital. Because here there was a centrality of the life insurance, but the central concept in the article that we have read here at CCI that you wrote with a co-author was social debt. So, and also, could you elaborate the consequences of this presentation to your controversy or your divergences with the racial capitalism approach?
Sure. Yeah, so I think I appreciate that question, and I'd love to know. I think yesterday and today we've sort of touched on this question of like Black subjectivity or subjectivity, how to think about it, how to historicize it. So I think some of what I'll say is related to that. I think I'm interested in forensics, meaning that I'm interested in one, like how a kind of inquiry about how someone died shapes how we think about their value or how value is transferred. Maybe an example I could give is when Malcolm X, his father was killed, and it was obvious his father was killed by the Klan, but the medical examiner, the police ruled his death a suicide. So because they ruled the death a suicide, the family couldn't collect the life insurance policy. Because there was no life insurance policy, they were plunged into poverty. Because they were in poverty, the kids were stealing and the household was in chaos. The mother was eventually institutionalized in a mental institution. He was in a life of crime. They, you know, so the whole family was like fragmented, arguably because of this decision. If they had the life insurance policy, they would have had some support and it would have had a very different outcome. So that's what interests me about forensics, how essentially what looks like a criminal inquiry or a detective inquiry has these huge financial repercussions, or even like it could be a fatal accident, but like is like BP oil spill, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, 11 people died, untold damage to wildlife. How we think about who's liable and how much they owe shapes a lot about possibilities for kind of social life, right? So I think that's what interests me. I think the other way I think about forensics is sort of that as a person, your own legal standing, or as a country, your legal standing is related to your social mobility or something like that. Like for a person, it's like if you're formally convicted of a crime, you may have certain possibilities eliminated for jobs you can have or roles you can have in society. Or if you owe a lot of debt, that may restrict opportunities for you. Or if you're a country and you're seen as like a rogue state or a terrorist watch list state, or you're not seen as having sovereignty in the eyes of sort of nation states or something, sovereign standing, it changes possibilities versus if you're a democratic state or a law-abiding citizen. So I think of forensics both in terms of that specific financial operation, but also in terms of profiling, strategies of profiling, you know. I guess that relates to the next part of your question, because I think one of my concerns about the discourse of racial capitalism, I think it's not intersectional in terms of how it's used. And I think I don't like concepts that are not intersectional. They're not that interesting to me. They're not that rigorous to me. I think, and I actually would go so far as to say that I think the term racial capitalism, how it's used, is often misogynist because instead of talking about gender and sexuality and ability, all these various things, it's just talking about race. And even if you look at Cedric Robinson and who he thinks of as the architects of the Black radical tradition, it's all men. And I just think that there's like a lot of investment in this kind of paradigm without attention to, say, Kimberly Crenshaw's work or Patricia Hill Collins' work, or there's the work of a lot of Black feminists you could be using to think about injustice, oppression, inequality in a more nuanced way. So I just wonder, like, why the emphasis on Cedric Robinson? Why the emphasis on this approach? Why this term when there are other terms that are much more intersectional and much more rigorous? So that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Michael, thank you very much for your presentation. I want to ask you about how deal with a black agency, because over here in Brazil, we have a kind of exaggerating that in that term, like historians as Cisne Chayub, Flávio Gomes, João José Reis, talked a lot about the possibilities of negotiation and conflicts in the 80s, 90s. But even in the plantation conditions, enslavers had like plots. And when we are talking about like peasants in Brazil, Flávio Gomes always talking to us about black peasants. The first peasants in Brazil are black. They are not from Europe or Italy or Russian or or where else. At the same time, we are kind of exaggerating the possibility of negotiation because we are always talking about someone black made a church, someone black was like a smart engineer, and we are talking about the Rebouças and guys like that. But we are talking about Brazil. We are talking about like a really hard situation of like violence and like a couple weeks ago we had 120 people died by the police in the state of Rio. So how deal with black agency, not like really exaggerating the possibility of the negotiation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, this brings me back to something you mentioned as well that I think is important. I would say there's concerns about, say, Black oppression and Black suffering, and then the response to that sometimes is about Black resistance or Black agency or even sort of Black joy. You see various attempts. I would say that's not my approach. My approach is more about trying to historicize social relationships and historicize Black subjectivity. So, and so for me also, for instance, the opposite of oppression is not, or the opposite of a kind of focus on oppression is more a focus on ingenuity. It's not something like joy and it's not agency. It's just the dynamism of what people are doing. And so the reason why I say that is because I don't think it's useful to exaggerate like agency as you're saying, but I also think that if you're explaining to me a way that people were oppressed, I'm sure we can find evidence of how they were strategizing around it, building networks, cultivating expertise. And then even there's sometimes contradictions, and this goes to your point, like about the very person in a certain role. Well, what is that role ultimately about? Like you could argue that some of the people who led slave insurrections were themselves in a role to punish and discipline other slaves. And so sometimes their work was like disciplining, punishing other slaves, but because of that, they had a lot of mobility and they could move from plantation to plantation. They sometimes led slave uprisings. You get what I'm saying? So they both were like detrimental to the lives of other enslaved people for a period of time and then beneficial to the lives of other enslaved people when it suited them strategically. And I think that's what interests me, is trying to explain those kinds of relationships, you know? Or like an enslaved person in a household who uses that privileged position or access to poison a planter, there's like in the US more attention to the role of Black women as spies for the Union Army. So they're like spying on owners and planters and things like that. So I think it's more just looking at the contradictions, the contestation, the strategy. That's sort of my approach. But I understand the concern because obviously when people are facing economic, political inequality, you don't want to overlook that, erase that. You don't want to seem like you're telling a kind of triumphant story that's overlooking these injustices. I think that's a real issue. Um, I would just say that to me, though, I'm just very interested in just the nuance of the histories. And I think that the more nuanced, the better in terms of how we tell these stories. And I would just sort of, I'm not, I'm not really interested in any approach that's like totalizing. And I think that some of the approaches that that people put forth as beneficial to Black people, because they're totalizing, they wind up being, I think, very detrimental, and I would argue even conservative. Because if for instance, someone's position is that Black people all like if it's not historicized, and it winds up seeming like Black people have always been in a state of suffering and exploitation, that's not actually different than what the far right would say. They would say Black people have never contributed anything meaningful to world history. So to me, it doesn't matter if you think you care about Black people or you hate Black people. If your position is Black people have never contributed anything meaningful to world history, that's both empirically wrong and also detrimental to Black people. So I think there's a version of a kind of far right conservative argument that masquerades as radical and progressive that's very dangerous. So I just think the solution to that is just to historicize and bring nuance to the analysis. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your for your presentation. I have a more of a doubt. I was thinking about. I really like the abolitionist like scholars that kind of make us see what I also like as a term, the prison industrial complex is like so profitable for capitalism, for global capitalism, and like this space where you just incarcerate, and without that we would not have like profits in so many other um, economic sectors. I think, as I read it, I was just wondering. Also, from your presentation, you mentioned a case where this person was insured without knowing, like the person who died of HIV. And yeah, if there is any, if you also came across any case of like life insurance in people who are imprisoned, like if there is also that kind of like, yeah, insurance in this industry.
Okay, thank you. But what is the doubt that you refer to?
Is there like also like insurance in like that people go through when they like are imprisoned?
I see.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have not found an example of people being insured in that way who are incarcerated, but I think that your question is related to an important point that insurance is kind of one kind of extraction, and there are other kinds of extraction, and it's just like if there's insurance only shows up, it shows up in many different contexts, but it always shows up under certain conditions. There are interesting questions to be asked about why insurance is ever being used. So, for instance, I've never seen women who delivered babies on plantations being insured, even though they're very valuable. So why not? I don't know why not exactly. Like, so maybe they weren't rented out. So maybe it's like they're not leaving the plantation. Maybe because the operation is happening within the plantation. Or even enslaved people who are picking cotton could be very valuable, but they weren't insured. Like cutting sugarcane or picking cotton, you could be like worked to death and replaced. So there's like a different business model there. They're more like machinery that breaks down and gets discarded versus like someone who's doing some artisanal work that's highly valued, who needs a lot of mobility. You see what I'm saying? So like maybe incarcerated people aren't seen as doing artisanal work where they're going to be insured, or maybe because they're not leaving the prison itself, they're not being insured and rented out or something like that. There's something about the structure of the labor and the mobility and the extraction that insurance is sometimes used for, but it's not always used for. But part of why I like your question a lot is that I sometimes see arguments about what a prison is or is not, but it's really, it depends on, there's many different financial projects happening in a prison. So there's like, I mean, I've taught in prisons and things like that, and it blew my mind to discover that the people who are incarcerated have like Walkman, like cassette players, like see-through cassette players. People don't even have cassette players in general anymore, but they can buy cassette players because they're not allowed to have CDs because they say you can kill somebody with a CD. So they have cassette players, but that must mean there's like catalogs for incarcerated people to buy cassette players. So there's like whole industries just for incarcerated people. So you're like, okay, because there's millions of people in the United States who are incarcerated, there's whole industries catering to them. So there's money being made off of them, or there's like a lot of telecommunications, prison telecommunications, like charging them to send emails and make phone calls to their families. You know, there's so many forms of extraction in a prison, or there's like the stock market, the Corrections Corporation of America stocks being traded, right? So there's like, it's the labor exploitation, but there's other so many forms of exploitation. It's kind of like a university. Like we say university, we think like, okay, people are teaching and doing research, but there's like the real estate arm, there's the intellectual property arm. There's like when you have a research lab and just the donors who want to give money for that lab to the university, which is like revenue. You know, there's like what is a university? You know, like it's not just people in class and people publishing. It's like so many different kinds of businesses happening at the same time. And I think prisons are the same way. So I think I like your question because it's like we have to think creatively about all the different projects happening that are generating revenue, you know? So yes. Oh, the microphone's going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. I don't have a rough question, so it's gonna be a simple one. You mentioned that the value of a slave person was based on their skills and expertise by insurance companies. So I would like to know if you found some monetary value for men and women. So just to know the difference between men and women as asset. And I'm African from Angola. So I would like to know if you have some comparative study or a research project about life insurance and slave in African country.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a project about life insurance and slavery in African countries, but I do want to do more work in Cuba and Brazil on rental of enslaved people and insurance. And I don't think it was always tied to insurance, but definitely the rental of enslaved people in Cuba and Brazil is really interesting. And I think it would be like revealing for some of the things I'm trying to explain. And especially because it went on obviously longer than slavery in the United States. So I'm very interested both in like the shipping insurance side and then the rental market and stuff. So I'm very interested in that. I mean, I would love to think about even earlier relationships, maybe between Brazil and Angola, and if there was some kind of insurance relationships there. So maybe on the earlier side, that would be very interesting. So thank you. But yeah, I think this question of men and women. So it shows up in a way, right, in the occupations because some of them are more sort of male oriented, female oriented, or they're gendered as male or female. So or man is woman. So like okay, blacksmith, cobblers, these tended to be men, drivers, clerks. But one of the professions that was sort of highly insured and stuff was like people who ran households. That was usually women. And that's interesting because I don't know that domestic workers are always perceived as valuable in that way. But what is important is to note that like if you were it would be like if you if it, like as we're saying an estate has many different industries. And if you're the person who runs that estate, in a sense, you're quite powerful. It'd be like how many CEOs, billion-dollar CEOs, could survive if they lost their chief of staff? You know what I'm saying? So like if you're the chief of staff on a plantation estate, that's an incredibly valuable role, particularly if you knew the family over many generations. What if you had like raised multiple generations of the family members? You know all their needs, all their dietary concerns, all their business and secrets, all their relationships, all their anything, you know? So I think there's something very important about that gendering of that role, particularly of women, certain women who had this mastery of the estate and everything like that. So certainly gender shows up in those ways. Or like I said, I mean, it's a bit mystery. I want to think more about women who delivered babies, either not just had babies, but essentially they were like in the 19th century in the United States, doctors were evaluated based on their track record. Not, it wasn't like how it is now, like your credentials or what school you went to. So if you think about the people who are delivering lots of babies successfully, it was like in certain enslaved women. So that means they were like highly regarded medical experts and things like that. So there's certain roles that we just need a lot more research on to better understand like enslaved women who were doctors. Sometimes we see stuff like that because like the guy who's the founder of obstetrics in the United States, J. Marion Sims, he experimented on a lot of enslaved women, and he also trained them as surgical assistants and things like that. So you're like, okay, they had medical expertise for sure because they were doing surgeries, but I think there's a lot more to be said about gender and expertise in some of these roles for sure.
It's best known just only to share a thing.
Yeah.
Curiosity, because we were talking about, you know, continuities, about the historical perspective, what's happening nowadays. And I just searched it here in Google about life insurance and some other financing possibilities. And I was also researching racism. It's interesting because there are a few banks in Brazil being sued for racism, but the causes, the reasons, one of the factors that it has to do with inequality of access and also benefits, and it has to do with inequality in access to life insurance, for example, and also other insurances and financing possibilities. But I think that maybe it's has to do with, you know, the idea that we're always connecting. That is this idea of a structural racism, but it's always connected with, for example, difficulties about informality for Black people, maybe because they have difficulty accesses to work, sometimes access to health or education level, you know, socioeconomic factors. But it's interesting. Now it says
Yeah, it's great. Great example. It's actually something that I think part of what Du Bois is trying to get at. So like after emancipation in the United States, one of the biggest Black businesses was like life insurance companies. I mean, basically funeral homes and life insurance companies, because both industries are kind of segregated. And so like, you know, Black people are very reliant on those industries. And even Black life insurance companies might charge Black people, usually charge Black people higher premiums because Black people just have lower vital statistics, lower life expectancy. So there's this way that if you're using an actuarial framework, you're going to be punishing certain groups of people. Like, you know, part of a life insurance policy is your projected future wages. If women make less than men on a dollar, women would have lower future wages, which means women have lower life insurance policies. So there's something about the framework, which presents as scientific and actuarial and mathematic, that's embedding these biases in these forms of inequality. And that's what makes it so insidious, because it's like, it would seem like just a calculation, but the calculation itself is premised on these historical social relationships. And then also, yeah, it's like tricky to get outside of it or something, or to sort of challenge it. But one thing I would say is, I guess part of what interests me about life insurance is that life insurance in the United States doesn't come about till slavery is basically ending. And so you could say it's quite different than slavery, because obviously slavery has a calculus in what each person's life is worth, and you can go to a slave market and just buy different people for different amounts. But life insurance is also like a calculus, a monetary calculus, and it's a hierarchy, but it's based on like privileged information, like health information or salary information. So it's almost like a privatized hierarchy in monetary lives that's not readily available to you like a slave market is, you know? So it's a kind of like inversion of the logic. It's like not a society where you can just know obviously who's worth more than someone else. It's only underwriters and actuaries who know that. And we think of it like we're in a free society, but and even an equal society maybe. But to like an actuary underwriter, we're not equal. They may be like, oh yeah, okay, but this person dies, they'll be worth this amount. This person dies, they're worth this amount. And this kind of like became very evident in the United States with like 911, the sort of 9/11, because Congress interpreted that as like an attack on America. So let's say you own a hedge fund, you're a billionaire, or you were just a waiter in a restaurant. You both died in 9/11. They didn't want a scenario where one person's family got $3 billion, other person's family got $2,000. They just thought that was offensive. So they're like, okay, maybe the person who's supposed to get $3 billion will only get $500 million, and the person who's supposed to get 2,000, we give them 20,000. But they were trying to figure out a way to kind of like make it not as obvious that one person's life is worth exponentially more than another. But the fact remains that in these calculations, that's what's happening. You know, so the examples you're giving and the examples we could come up with are sort of showing something different than how we prefer to think of it. And I just think personally that, you know, this is the society we have is one where our lives are worth drastically different amounts. We may want to talk about it in different language, but I think we need to contend with what is happening in these calculations and in these relationships.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
We're going to have lunch.
Yeah, so we're having lunch
Yeah.
now. Before I go to lunch, I was asked to please raise your hands if you're going to the party tonight. I was asked to ask that.
To the party.
Yes.
I'm not sure yet, but.
Keep your hands up, please.
18. É.
25% mais.
Okay, that's a lunch. We'll be back.
Okay. Does somebody need to turn? Do I need to stay here till somebody turns something off?
That's oh, there's
Okay, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Great comments.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. No, great comments.
Discussion.